Why does someone stay with someone that isn't good for them? Why are some relationships last for a long time and they thrive, and others last for a long time and they don't? The very thing we want most is love, and the very thing that sits right next door is the hurt.
Every relationship itself is a bit like a tree. One person can't invest for 50 years if the other person's hoping to harvest that tree in 2 years.
Lay truth at the table, because if you lay truth at the table, the system starts to orient around truth. And if we place truth ahead of staying together, now we're really cooking.
Adam had a fantastic video. The 3 secrets I keep from my wife. What extent of communication authenticity is really adequate in a relationship?
Is pain in your relationships one of the best ways for you to grow as a person? Is conflict actually necessary for you to grow as a person and maybe as a couple? Is it absolutely vital for you to struggle sometimes so that you can reach true happiness? We have Mark Groves on today on the I Wish You Knew podcast to talk to us about the role of pain and struggle and difficulty, and yes, even that C word, conflict, and how it's actually helpful in some ways for you to grow and for you to be a great couple and form a loving relationship.
Mark, tell us a little bit about yourself. This should be really interesting. I'm excited. So tell us a little bit about yourself and also maybe one thing that you wish people knew.
Oh, man. Okay, well, first off, thanks for having me on. I am obsessed with understanding and really helping share and disseminate information on human behavior. Like, I've been obsessed my whole life. That shift went from being in sales and trying to figure out how to manipulate human behavior to having a relational breakdown in my late 20s. I was engaged, and I thought to myself, why am I so good at talking about everything but my feelings? This is not a skill set issue. There's something else going on. So I dove deep because my background at that time was in pharma, in the reading clinical trials, things like that for the work that I did. I dove deep into the science of relationships because I wanted to understand it from the more logistic, linear perspective. I wondered, like, why does someone get engaged when they don't want to? Like, why does someone stay with someone that isn't good for them? Why are some relationships last for a long time and they thrive, and others last for a long time and they don't? I really wanted to know what differentiated people who were good at relationships and happy and people who were not, and what separated those couples. So that dove me deep into this learning for myself. So it was very selfishly oriented first. I went back, studied positive psychology because I was so fascinated, like, oh, here's a science about high functioning humans. Instead of exploring what's broken about people, let's look at what actually makes a human thrive. And that positive orientation was something that it just was such a different way of seeing the world, especially when we have such a negative bias towards everything. And it led me to start writing about the things I was learning about myself, and then started an Instagram, started a podcast, and apparently other people wanted to learn about love and relationships too. And I feel like we were all set up by not getting this education in school. So here I am. And what is one thing I wish everybody knew? Oh man, I think if there was one thing that would really help change how people orient to relationships in life, it would be that every single emotion you have is valuable. That if you are experiencing grief, anger, depression, anxiety, the way the world teaches us is that there's something wrong with you that you have that feeling, as opposed to what happens if you start to orient yourself from a place of there's something right with you that you have that feeling. And then what it's really trying to do is inform you about your environment, what you tolerate, not just from others, but from yourself. And really to start to have an introspection of, like, where are you not aligned with your own values? Do you even know what you need? Do you even know what you want? And beginning that curious adventure of, instead of like, oh my gosh, I have so much to learn. I can't believe I didn't learn this 5 years ago, 10, 15, but it like, what an opportunity I have. And so I think that would be my one hope that everyone has.
I love this so much. What you're talking about is the systemic model. Just for background for you, I was a licensed marriage and family therapist for many years, and they grounded into our heads that there is nothing wrong with the individual. It is the system that has shaped them, and it's their response to that system. So if you change the system and help them acclimate to a better system, the vast majority of people will change and improve as long as you give them the tools to do that. And it's so funny. You are definitely not the first pharmaceutical sales individual that I've heard who then excelled in their position and then couldn't maintain a romantic relationship and said, what is it about this that I am not doing right? Can you talk to me a little bit about maybe what the skills were that made you excel over here, but maybe they kept you from having connection and romance?
Oh, what a great question. I'm so happy to hear that there's other former farmer reps who are in a karmic repairing.
Oh, yeah, I hear you.
Because I don't know how you can wake up to emotional, first off, how deeply emotion and conflict and the inability to have successful relationships is so incredibly correlated to inflammation and to gut dysbiosis, all the different types of things, and not start to see that the core of what really causes these things, I would argue, is relational. Is trauma within relationship, in childhood, etc. I'd say the skill that made me really good at being a salesperson was that I could really intuit other people's needs, wants, and beliefs. I could really get to the root of their psyche, and I'd say and really what was the need that they had that made them choose a product. Where that didn't help me in romantic relationships is it was an adaptive strategy that I developed to be in the system I was in, as you're aware of. And so it made it so I overfunctioned in relationships. I was codependent. I was always needing to be needed. So it made me really good at keeping people close. But in a way, it made me never have the opportunity to fully be myself and to allow someone to show up for me and receive love from someone else.
Well, it's an interesting thing too, is that nowadays love is becoming a product. So people who are like you, who are actually really good at sales, but for you in professional capacities, for other people at just learn capacities, people who are becoming really good at sales can succeed at this game of selling love. However, that's not correct. That does not give us fulfillment, because then you're always at work and you always have to perform, and you measure it by these KPIs and results and status that comes with it. So one thing that you talk about extensively is the need for communication. Like, communication is the thing that breaks through this story that we tell ourselves consistently about the way that we choose to engage in the acts of love, not just the physical, but also the spiritual, the mental. So what forms of communication have you seen are the most effective in conveying the true purpose behind these relationships, as opposed to just engaging and keeping up the system?
Well, I think part of communication, it sort of has two parts. The first one is the actual competence, right? Like the skill set, because you could ask someone to communicate some feedback to their partner, but if it's structured in the wrong way, you're like, how do I say something to my partner without getting them reactive? It's like, well, I listened to how you start that. And it's, I think it's like the Gottman's work, how they talk about how all fights seemingly end how they begin. So, they really emphasize a soft startup. So I think there's the skill set aspect of communication that's really important. And then on the other side of that, you have that communication. Often our communication is actually the skills we have are derived around defending ourselves from being hurt. And so if you look at relationships, and no matter the type, I just think romantic relationships are an amplification to our dysfunction. It doesn't mean you can't have someone in a team dynamic at work who's got some real defensiveness and some challenges. That stuff's going to show up there, but it's really going to show up when your self-worth is on the line, when your wound is really being activated by somebody who you're trying to create a relationship with. And so that aspect of being able to look at the ways that you actually try to protect yourself from being hurt, because I think one of the greatest ironies, maybe it's a joke from the universe, is that the very thing we want most is love, and the very thing that sits right next door is the hurt that we associate with love. So we avoid love, but we're really avoiding hurt. And so I always think that a trigger is an invitation to mastery and a skill set that actually allows you to walk towards what you're most afraid of. It's just we don't want to walk towards that thing because we didn't have the skill when we got hurt when we were young. And so the shame we have about a circumstance or an experience often has us put that memory or that thing in a box and then hide it away. But it's actually through the exploration of that thing that you build the skill to then open up more, if that makes sense.
A lot of guys live in conflict with their own appearance, even their own facial hair. If you are struggling with your facial hair, if you are looking for building a great relationship with how you look, pick up Rugged Legacy Grooming Supplies today. It will help you become that person you want to be, pain-free. Now, you've said two things so far that really fascinated me, and it ties back with a third thing that I've heard you say several times online. The first thing there that you said was you were overperforming in your relationships. And I loved the way you phrased that, because people with, I study attachment theory, people with attachment challenges, those connections, childhood wounds, as you've said, when they have that, they are overperforming everywhere they go. And the second thing that you said that really tied to that was, people can have these challenges at work, or you can excel in sales and be phenomenal at those experiences when they're short-term transactional relationships. You can just be amazing. But long-term relations in romance, where the risk is high, where the intimacy is high, where the energy burn is so high, you are pouring yourself into it and overperforming at a constant level. This is why most of the guys that come into my coaching practice, they're high performing, they've made their fortune, or they're high level execs, but they are utterly exhausted in romance, and everybody else around them is demonizing them for not being loving enough, not being intimate enough. And the third thing I've heard you say that really ties into this, and I really want to dig into this with you, is the conversations you're not having are still right there. They are haunting every step. They're haunting every text message. They're haunting everything you don't say. Every little interaction is haunted by the things you aren't confronting. And I think that's the biggest piece of the overperforming, is if you've got this giant block in front of you and you have to do 5 flips to try to get around it, you are wrecked. Can you talk to us a little bit about those people that you've seen doing that? What is that causing for those people who are high performers, who are over engaging, over indulging in those pieces and burning themselves out in a way that maybe they don't have to?
Yeah, my friend Terry Cole, the psychotherapist, she talks about how these are high functioning codependents. So, we really, so much, I think for men specifically, so much of our worth is derived in our ability to provide, right? And our ability to actually be, to have, we're really judged on providing, protecting, and procreating. That's sort of the quote unquote old model, but I would argue that it's still it's very hot right now still. And so it's like, you have the one aspect that in my relationships, I can't fully be myself. Like I'm afraid to actually have the hard conversation, so I'll just avoid these things. And look, I'm not speaking from a pulpit. I'm saying like shit. I remember when I was dating my first girlfriend, looking at a rose that I gave her for an anniversary, we'll go into how that lacks any creativity. But this was in the 90s. Okay, give me some credit. But I remember looking at the rose and it was dying, and I was thinking to myself like, kind of like our relationship. And I remember thinking, I should say something. But what I actually ended up doing was being like, nah, it'll be fine. It'll work itself out. Spoiler alert,
done that.
Definitely. Yeah.
Done
So
that
like,
too many times.
right. And so we sweep it under the carpet, and eventually you trip on the pile that's under the carpet. And what I realized through that was like my avoidance of conflict was not altruistic. It was not, I thought it was like, oh, I'm doing a good thing. Now, really unconsciously, what I'm doing is avoiding conflict, because conflict can lead to a fracture in attachment, a fracture in connection. But what it's presenting as is like, oh, I'm going to avoid these. They can't handle the truth. They're too reactive. They won't be able to hear this. That's not love. First off, if you are not sharing what you truly feel, someone doesn't get to truly know you. So you never really get fully known in your relationships. And then you feel like you don't feel fully loved, but you haven't actually brought the full version of yourself there, which is really because we're afraid of being rejected. But what happens in a fear of bringing our full selves to the relationship and thereby not doing it for fear of rejection is we live in the very embodiment of rejection. And so my prayer for everybody is to say, lay truth at the table. Because if you lay truth at the table, the system starts to orient around truth. Now, most of us develop our adaptive strategies, things like being really intuitive and being great, very gregarious, being great at sales. These are all superpowers when they're harnessed, but before that, they're manipulation. And that sounds like a criticism or a negative word, but the behavior itself needs to be called out for what it is. It's a shadow behavior, and it's operating from a place of fear. And when you don't tell someone the truth because you don't think they can handle it, one, you get to live the story. Two, you also get to blame them for not having the capacity for being able to hold what you want to share. And three, they never get to become the person who can hold it. So we end up recreating the very relational dynamics we're trying to avoid. And I'd say on top of all this is that we are not experiencing love in those circumstances, and we're not experiencing freedom. I think about how often we pursue everything we love when we leave relationships. We all of a sudden pursue our dreams, and I'm like, why wouldn't we actually make the relationship the place that truth gets honored? And if we place truth ahead of staying together, now we're really cooking, because that's actually the way that relationships truly thrive, is that they say, I'm going to tell you the truth, and I'm not going to protect you from your feelings, because I'm sure that's probably happened in your life. I trust that you can hold this. And there's a deeper bond that gets created from that, because look at our society. This is a micro and a meta. We're placing feelings ahead of reality. We're placing feelings ahead of truth. And I could tell you right now that's just a giant trauma response that's masquerading as altruism, and it's bullshit.
And it's not sustainable. And in fact, many of us grew up in families that were not sustainable, and we learned skills in an unsustainable system, which we then carry out into the world. So the only thing we know how to build is unsustainable relationships.
Yeah, and we actually talked about this extensively throughout many of our videos and many of our podcast interviews. And there's a foundational issue here, and the foundational issue is really trust mixed with control, right? I do not trust you to be able to process this, and I choose to control the narrative, to control the relationship in a way that makes me feel safe, in a way that makes me feel safe myself by controlling your reaction upon me and upon our family system, financial system. There is an element that I'm curious to delve into, and that is what extent of communication authenticity is really adequate in a relationship. Adam had a fantastic video, and that video was about the three things, I think the three secrets I keep from my wife. That there are certain things that we do not, as men, need or should be bringing into conversations and relationships. And I've noticed that with myself. And there's kind of an element of filtration that has to happen in order to protect everybody from absolutely everything that's going in your mind. So what is your standpoint on authenticity versus true, genuine care? Both with relationships, but also things like families, your kids, where you're trying to build that trust and control balance in a way that's healthy and productive without overwhelming them.
Man, what a good question, and one that's going to have so much subjectivity to different people's experience of what needs to be shared and what doesn't. And I'd argue a lot of that will probably be shaped by culture and influenced by religion and family systems and all the things that we learn growing up. So we have to start to tease out what is a value that we hold in truth and what is one that we've been told to hold. And I don't get to be the arbitrator of that. But what I will say is that if holding a truth is harmful to a relationship, then you know that it needs to be shared. Because sometimes I think this line of transparency versus privacy, which I think is an important line, and also a line that we're all navigating with things like social media, is that line is only one we know. We're the ones who know whether we're withholding or not. And I think we can sometimes use the idea that I'm going to hold on to this truth to protect my partner from some information that might, quote unquote, cause them harm. But then here we are again, potentially overfunctioning and managing the dynamic. Because what you were saying, Andrey, which I think is fascinating culturally, is that when we start to control narratives and truth and information, which we're talking about, I call this collective codependency. It's the micro masquerading as the macro because, as you both have said, like we didn't have family systems that modeled healthy relating. So we just created political systems, news systems, all these systems operate under the same premises. Because if we don't watch people who are supposed to be the models of our society have dialogue and actually navigate discourse and actually disagreement in successful ways, it's not modeled for anybody, but it's not modeled by parents. It's not modeled like we're able to have a long form conversation, which allows us to hear the nuances of dialogue, which I think short form conversations is really reels. These are destroying a lot of our ability to be critically thinking because we don't hear the skill set being lived. And so what happens when I decide that you can't handle information is I infantilize you. So I become the parent. If we look at the trauma triangle, I become the savior, you're the victim, and someone else is quote unquote the perpetrator. And I think when we think about withholding things, if I was to just, because I really like that point of inquiry of like 3 secrets I keep from my wife. One, it's a provocative statement that's going to make people like, what the is he keeping from his wife? But the second part, yeah, which I, of course, is a great way to, give people what they, tell people what they want, give them what they need, right? Like draw them in. But I actually, that it's such a powerful point of inquiry because then I think, well, how would I differentiate what needs to be shared and what doesn't? And I believe I would play with the idea, is this actually harming the connection I have? Do I feel like I'm having to hold this secret alone, or I have shame that's attached to the thing and I'm really trying to create an excuse to not actually share this with them? But what happens then is my shame doesn't get witnessed. And I think a lot of our shame, which shame really has, I think, been distorted in some ways because we think that shame is only toxic. And while I certainly agree that Brene Brown's work is incredible, I think what's happened, because there hasn't been a differentiation, that shame is the exact right emotion you should have when you violate your own values and morality.
It's the biggest driver of progress, right? A shame and within yourself. And we had a great conversation about this in sense of fatherhood just the other day, that shame is going to be the number one thing that will make you better, because there's no emotion that you can escape that is, like shame. Like it really is omnipresent until you are forced to deal with it. And it has exceptional value for that. It's absolutely feedback. Adam, I have a question for you in that sense. What role do negative feelings have in your development as a human being, especially as a man?
Well, so the research on this is fascinating. There are people who are born without the ability to feel pain, and their life expectancy is about 15 years.
That's it?
Yeah.
So no pain at all?
They
Is it
cannot
because they
feel pain.
run into trees and stuff?
They can't tell if they get cut. They can't tell if they get burned. They can't
Wow.
tell if they're like too cold and freezing to death. So the average life expectancy is incredibly low. Our ability to feel pain, it not only keeps us alive, but then it helps us to grow. It helps us to develop. Like when you do something that is in a non-optimized state for you, you experience pain. So then the answer is, what is my optimal state? How can I reach it? The devastating piece, though, is if you get trapped and don't believe there's an optimal state or that you can never reach one, then your pain is eternal. That's where you start to really head down the bad path toward more depression, more like self-harm kind of areas. But pain is enormously helpful for teaching. It's one of the best teachers there is.
Well, that's why some people say life is suffering. The Buddhist standpoint is life is suffering, and it's not particularly portrayed as a positive thing, but the further you delve into the studies of various religions and beliefs and philosophies, the more you understand that suffering is a key definition of life.
Well, and to a point, I had a client just the other day. He's about 30 years old. He has not had a girlfriend. He's experiencing a lot of pain, emotional pain and struggle. And we started off trying to get him to envision a better life, because that's what he was wanting. He said, I want to see a better life. I want to do this. And he was trying to go toward a pleasure focus, but he wouldn't do the homework that I was giving him between sessions. He wasn't following through. And it wasn't until we started saying, well, okay, are you actually pleasure focused or are you more pain focused right now? And he said, well, I just want the pain to stop. And I said, okay, well then let's shift everything. Let's talk about negative visualizations. Let's talk about leveraging the anticipation of pain without using pain to avoid the bad outcomes you're trying to avoid. That will guide you toward the new outcomes. And once he started doing that, the anticipation of pain from not doing homework, in his eyes, seeing the negative future if he doesn't follow through, he started like that. He started doing his homework immediately, and his relationships really started to improve dramatically. Pain and even in the anticipation of it can be enormously helpful in growth.
Well, actually then, Mark, you coach people, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what is your experience in terms of your whole coaching practice? How many people are pain driven versus pleasure driven?
I'd say that most people start to orient towards growth because of pain. So I would say 99.9% of people, it might even be 100, but I just want to be mindful.
I don't
It's like,
really know a single person. No, I know one. I know one person in my entire life. He's one of the happiest people I've ever met, who is literally driven by pleasure. Very successful, great guy. Name is Dimitri, fantastic dude. And he goes to me at one point, he goes, I was depressed for one day in my life and it sucked. I'm just like, how do you
study
live,
him.
man?
He's like the David Goggins of emotion.
Right? It's awesome.
I do think like this is one of the things that I find very fascinating about personal growth is that we're generally drawn towards therapy, coaching, courses, books, etc. Like when I went through that engagement ending, I read Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. I would have never picked that book up, but I was trying to understand the world because, I think about it from the perspective of initiations, right? Like more Jungian type of approach to experiences in our lives so there's three core tenets of an initiation. One is the world we knew no longer exists. Who we knew ourselves to be doesn't make sense anymore, and we can't go back to what was. Now, we might existentially call that a dark night of the soul. We might, from a psychotherapy perspective, call it a psychotic break. But either way, there's something that doesn't work anymore. And as humans, we want to try to put ourselves back in the box. We want to go back to certainty. We want to go back to predictability. And I would argue that most addictive things and most things that we sell to people, like the way the algorithms are set up, things like products that are associated with trying to look younger or drugs to get more muscular, like all these shortcuts, which again, nothing bad about wanting those things, but just like how we're always trying to figure out how to not suffer in order to get them is because these are all marketed to our suffering as these ways of alleviating suffering, because we live in a culture that says negative feelings are something wrong with you, so fix the thing that's wrong with you. And what I love about this conversation is actually you need the suffering. Like, not that we hope for suffering or we want someone to suffer, but Francis Weller has this great line where he says, "Don't waste a good divorce." And I totally agree with that. It's like,
that should be on a
here
mug.
you are, right? And so I am fascinated, though, with what you said, Adam, about, okay, so if we're open to suffering, then now we're oriented to like, how do I grow from this? What do we think about then people who don't have the ability to experience empathy? And because when I think about the impact on their lifespan, it probably doesn't, because they don't even feel. They're so disassociated from it. So I'm curious what you guys think about that, because I think it's interesting that people who don't experience physical pain have a short lifespan.
So empathy is an interesting thing. A lot of people don't realize that my earliest gig as a therapist wasn't working with families and couples and all the fun stuff. I got thrown into working with death penalty inmates who had committed, 5, 10 murders. And that was my very first gig. And
oh my God, damn.
It was fantastic.
Like, welcome to the deep end.
It was fantastic. Fresh out of school, and they were like, all right, you will work with people who've killed 5 people, and then they will come in and they will tell you how they were justified and how it was that person's fault for having been murdered.
And this wasn't on Zoom, was it?
No. So they would walk them in. They'd put me in a room. They'd walk them in. They'd shackle them to the floor, and then I'd sit there across the table from them and speak to them. How you doing? You're shackled to the floor. You're going through a trial for the death penalty. So I would work with these individuals, and many of them did lack empathy, but we would, so I would jump into it talking about them and say, look, I would like to understand you and help you stop killing people, hopefully. But let's talk about where you're at, and let's talk about it. And they were so suspicious at first that I would care about them being in pain. And then as they came to understand that I actually did kind of care about alleviating their pain, it wasn't just a paycheck, then they said, well, they'd start sharing with me about their pain. And as they did, they'd look at me with this really sharp look on their face, like, how are you going to use this information against me? So the only mechanism they understood was that nobody else was going to care about their pain at all. So their ability to care about other people's pain diminished to essentially zero. Then they could do whatever they had to survive, because the idea in their head was, I am only doing less than what someone would do to me if they got the chance. Whether they were assaulting somebody, murdering somebody, just taking from somebody. The goal was never to murder somebody. The goal was to get something, and they didn't care what the outcome would be for the other person. And their justification was, everybody on earth would do exactly the same thing to me if they got the chance. So the ability to understand that your pain does matter to another human being, that in essence does foster the empathy that you can then have the luxury of caring about somebody else's pain.
And this is an interesting point, because what this symbolizes to me is that empathy can be taught, right? Empathy can be taught using a painful experience, because the act of love is to care about somebody else's pain.
Well, and to that, I had one fantastic client come in. He was in his 40s. He had just had his first child with a young woman. But he was in for committing, I think it was grand theft auto at the time. But he had killed people before, and he was in a gang. And he was now going to drop out in his 40s and be targeted for killing by his gang. But it was because he now had his first child. And he started developing this sense of, look, it's not my pain anymore. Now my son is going to be in pain. And that was his moment where he said, I'm going to change everything, even if it does kill me. So I had to help him foster this new empathy and what it even meant. How would you care about your child's pain? Maybe the child's mother's pain. How can you start actually caring for that without being debilitated and collapse into codependency, or what Mark was talking about there? How do you navigate this careful balance between not caring and over caring?
Well, especially building the capacity to even hold, because if you're going to start to be empathic and feel pain and start to process things, let's say in your 40s or your 30s, and you don't even have to be a murderer for this to be true, or someone who's committed crimes, is that you all of a sudden have to process how desensitized you've been to your own suffering. So that's why I think so much grief, like a divorce, a breakup, a loss of a job, a health thing, you're activating old grief. And so now you're getting hit with the Rolodex of all these experiences that from a survival perspective, you've learned to disassociate from. And I think for men especially, which obviously this can be true of either sex, but for men especially, there's been so much like just plow forward, do the thing, get it done, go to war. And even when we come back, and obviously women go to war now, but we come back and then there's no service or support. It's like, just hide it, put it down, plug it down. Here's an antidepressant. Here's an anti-anxiety drug. And again, it's like we don't have these. I think a lot about how in our families, in our cultures, in our communities, we don't see someone suffering as an opportunity to be a teacher to the community. Like when someone goes through a divorce and they feel like their experience might be exile from their community, which that happens a lot. It's like, imagine if the community said, like, teach us, like, what didn't work? What did you learn from that? And then now it's not a source of shame, it's a source of teaching. And that has been wild to me, that we actually shame people who go through breakups because they're walking through one. We might be jealous that they've liberated themselves, and so we want to liberate ourselves. But instead of actually stepping towards liberation, we shame their behavior because it's easier to keep them back in line, than to start to challenge a system. And I think the other side of that is that we don't know how to be with the grief of endings. So we like exile this person out of it instead of actually seeing how powerful and potent that is. And imagine if community said to people like, wow, we love you no matter what you choose. Oh my, what is possible when that is the way we orient to each other?
So this is actually a major issue from the perspective of culture and society. There used to be tremendous amounts of works and writings and plays and media of all kinds, specifically speaking about the human experience in the negative sense. Now, in the last probably about 50 years, if you track through the media, through the books, the things you get to read at school, that got cut out. We simply do not get to see that this negative dark side of the human psyche exists, and it is done for the protection, the infantilization, exactly as you call it, of humans as in general, right? You do not really get to immerse yourself into understanding how to function in your negative, in your darkness, in your stress, in your fear, nor do you really get to see how to function if you're actually shutting down your empathy. Because one of the biggest things that men specifically do, and a lot of women are starting to do as well, is that when they start getting stressed, they become overwhelmed, they shut that down. I know that in myself, that is one of my biggest stress responses. Feelings go off, my pain capacity is at its max, we're now turning that off, and then what? Right? So this is coming back to conversations, right? Having hard conversations. You need to learn how to have hard conversations when you are in a strong, negative, painful state, but you must also learn when your pain has become too much and you have shut down. So Mark, how do you have those conversations if you are already freaking out and are past the point for freaking out as B?
Yeah, I think because we have such a model of avoidance of conflict, then even to be able to hold the capacity for disconnection, the capacity for disagreement, so many people that are not familiar with having hard conversations, what's really going on at the root of it is they think a hard conversation means love no longer exists, that the relationship is not safe. And that can actually be that is obviously our true experience, or else it wouldn't be the thing we're afraid of. So being able to validate where it comes from, I think one of the most beautiful parts of understanding our past, I don't think it's necessary to change, because we can know a behavior's not something we want to engage in and not know where it comes from and change it. But I think what context allows is compassion, because as Adam, you were saying earlier, it's like when you look at a system and the adaptive strategy that someone has, it's actually the perfect response to the system. So I always think when someone says to me, I can't believe I do this, I'm like, how could you not? Like, that is actually evolutionarily the most efficient and effective way that you kept people close or kept people at a distance. But that was a child strategy and it worked then, but it doesn't work now. And so when I look at someone wanting to have hard conversations, first off, you don't go to the person who causes the most triggering for you. That's not the place to begin to work on the nervous system, because ultimately that's what we're talking about, is really reprogramming the capacity of the nervous system. And we know that even in a workplace, when someone says, can I give you some feedback? The prefrontal cortex shuts down already, because we're preparing to be criticized. And I'm someone I call myself a recovering defender, because I used to get really defensive. And when I read about and learned about the antidote to defensiveness, which I didn't like, but when I read about it, it was saying that one of the first things you can do is say to someone when they're giving you feedback is, I can see some truth in what you're saying. It sucks.
That's nasty. I don't
It's
like it.
Eating your own.
I don't want it. Give me another one.
It's such a powerful shift, because what I found when I started to say that, instead of defending my self-worth, because really it was the fragility of my own sense of self that I thought if I was getting feedback, I'm a failure, I'm not okay, I'm not safe. I started to see that it was actually through the receiving, instead of the defending, or like in a tennis match, smashing it back at them. I was like, I would receive it. And there was no pushing back. One, I found myself in a conversation I'd never been before. And two, I found my relationships now, I didn't know what I was doing, because now I'm in a place of like, oh, like what's possible if I start to see this feedback as a gift to my own evolution? There is truth, or else I wouldn't be so defensive about it. And even the most smallest part of a truth in something, it's liberating to think the material that comes up in our relationships is actually the exact stuff that needs to come up for us to heal.
And there's three pieces to that. And the reason I love your response there, I can see some truth in what you're saying. There's three things that people forget. Somebody's coming to you to give you feedback, right? That means they have been able to identify something that's off. Something is off, and they're calling it out for you. but they're also being gentle enough and considerate enough to say, hey, look, can I give you some feedback, instead of screeching it at you? So it's somebody who sees the problem and actually cares about fixing it and cares about how you're going to receive it. And number three, if they see the problem, they probably have the solution. So if you can step away from the defensiveness just for a moment and lean into that conversation, Mark, like you're talking about there, you have the answer. And you're going to grow with somebody who is about to teach you and hand it to you on a silver platter. The only thing stopping you is that defending.
So I actually want to focus on one word out of the words you said, see. Right? Anybody starting a conflict really is trying to be seen, trying to be noticed. They're not walking out and slamming the door saying, I'm done with you. It is actually an attempt of communication. Starting a fight, when my 6-year-old throws a tantrum, she doesn't want to be left alone. She wants to be noticed. And she'll do a lot of things, not anything, but almost anything to get noticed and get those needs met. It is actually an invitation. They want to be seen. And when you say, I see, that means you're already allowing for that connection to happen. That is such a powerful move that instantly gets probably rid of 60% of the conflict right there, because that aim is accomplished. Would you agree, Mark?
Yeah, I think, what do people desperately want at the core of their being? They want safety. Ultimately, that's like the biological need relating, and psychologically too. But the real key there is safety to be themselves, which really means the safety to be witnessed in their totality. And I would say most of our experience is a no to that. And so it's like, how do we take the responsibility? Because this is what it means to be an adult, is to say, okay, that wasn't fair, or that happened to me, but like, it's only through the loss of those things that I recognize the value of it, that I want to embody. And then how do I do that with my child? How do I do that with my partner? And how do I go first? Because I desperately want someone to witness me. Like, you witness me first. That's usually how we orient to it. And I think if we can start to, one of the most powerful quotes I ever heard was that we spend our lives seeking a place of belonging, but at some point we have to become a place of welcome. And I think that's the level of responsibility. I think as men, as leaders of our experience, which is not to say that women can't be leaders too, but I think for men in the leadership spot in a relationship, to actually lead that, to actually be willing to maybe not be seen in that first experience, but to be committed to the deeper integrity of that value, to say, like, I get it. You don't trust my witnessing. You don't trust it. And here's why you don't trust it. And I get that. You have every reason, but this is what I want to create together. How do we do that? And I'm just learning the deeper roots of that. I'm a new father. So, I'm sensing I'm a year into fatherhood, and what that has unlocked for me is a whole new level of integrity of, like, I now have more motivation than I did, even though I had a lot of motivation as a partner. Now I'm like, oh my God, everything I do has to align. Words and actions have to be fully embodied, because my son isn't just hearing me. He doesn't even understand. He's now understanding language, but he understands sense.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's like, can I be deeply rooted in what it means to be anchored in myself, my values, my integrity, and trust myself, which means he trusts me.
It's so true.
Yeah.
I've got 5 kids, and my oldest is my son, and
He's a pro.
I'm quite adept at making the children.
Yeah.
But
That's for another episode.
So my oldest, that's another one. I'll teach you that. So my oldest is my son, and he's 7.5. And I remember after he was born, like, just the wave of, like, I need to not be perfect, but I need to figure out how to get things right. I remember reading at the time a poem, and I couldn't quote it to you now, but the idea is that when you become a father, you have somebody who follows you everywhere you go. There is always a set of little feet following you, so be careful where you go, because the little feet are going to follow you. And that haunted me when I read that poem for the first 6 months. It's all I could think about, is where am I leading my son? And at the time, I thought I was the man I wanted to be, but then I started thinking about all the conversations I was avoiding, all the things I wasn't doing, all the places I was going that I never wanted him to set foot near.
Yeah, but here's also an interesting thing. So I have some qualm with the idea of, You as a husband, you as a man, leading your relationship. Yes, it is correct, but it's also a challenging notion because it puts in question the definition of the term leadership. And too many times it turns into a dictatorship. Leadership does not mean making people do what you want them to do. It is exactly as you said, creating a welcoming center where you can be wrong. And one of the most powerful things I started doing with my 6-year-old, now that she's starting to able to accentualize things, she can bring something to me. And then as it is unpleasant and it's hard, but I'm learning how to do it, I say, hey, whatever you're asking me to do, I don't know how to do it. Can you teach me? And that is the opening lines to communicating A, shame, I don't know how to do this, B, desire, that I want to learn how to do this, and also relationship, can you teach me? And every single time I've done this, it has worked spectacularly because it's starting to build that relationship and it's creating a point where a leader can be taught. A scary system exists in a place where you have no influence upon your leaders. This is actually one of the biggest things that people are freaking out about with the election coming up. I'm Canadian as well, so good luck, guys. So
I'm Canadian too. Yeah, good luck, everybody in the States.
We're rooting for you.
We've got one coming up not too long after that. I'm sure will have its own.
Yeah. So that's a later problem for us. But here's the thing, right? The thing that creates the most fear is the inability to impact your leadership. Like any good relationship involves a bilateral communication. Conflict is part of that bilateral communication. Would you guys agree? Is this an important part of a given feedback?
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful statement. Your qualm is well deserved. I haven't heard the word qualm in a while. I like it. But it's a well placed qualm because I don't even know if I'm using that right. But it is in that it's leadership absent of openness, and also this idea that leadership doesn't mean two leaders, it means one, right? And so we're still under, like, for the people who are in the shadow expression of that framework, it is that leadership is not collaboration. It's, as you were saying, or inferring, is like it's more dictatorial. And we're saying, okay, well, how do we be in relationships? Like my partner and I's framework of our relationship is that there's a mutual sense of positive regard and an understanding and acknowledgement of two separate paths. And that allows for there to be influence and compromise, and that the relationship itself is seen as a vehicle for both of our growth, for both of our possibilities. And I think when we look at this, there's an interesting sort of like leap. I want to hear Adam's thoughts first. And then one leap that I think is very fascinating is the relationship to social media, because it, in my experience of platforms like Meta and Instagram, is that it is actually not relational. And that's actually one of the large reasons that it has such a deep impact on mental health, but we can get into that. But I'm curious, Adam, what are your thoughts on influence and Andrey's qualm?
I love social media in many ways. I think that it has done a lot of good, obviously, for all, and we're all here for that reason. I think that it has helped people to find mentors, to find some components that have been missing. I do worry quite a lot about the people who try to replace family relationships, replace local relationships, replace friendships with social media. I think it has a wonderful place in our system, but I also don't think it should be replacing some of our core experiences either.
Well, this is definitely a field in which I am both immersed and also very interested in. So I've been running content creators for about 7 or 8 years now. So I was executive director for Jordan Peterson and a bunch of other creators, and I work with Adam. So we talk about this all the time. And the question is really, what is the purpose that social media is building for itself in human relationships? And it is not like anything we've ever experienced. This is now becoming the glue that allows us to communicate values, experiences, and positions at a global scale. So one thing we've never been able to do before as a society is actually enable us to listen to conversations when we needed to listen to them from a large enough number of humans. We did not have a large sample set. It was whether or not you could hear, your parents arguing in the next room, or witness the theological debate in your town square. That was the extent to which you could reach. Now we can actually engage in knowledge sharing in a wide range of places from a wide range of viewpoints and actually build ourselves on that. Social media is not a relationship replacement. It is simply a mechanism for us to get information about what relationships could be. And this is the problem. There is no coherent way yet to build a persona that we can build a relationship with in the digital space. That's something that AI can fill over time because it can curate for us what a human could be, assembling the best of all humans. However, right now, that is the role of content creators like yourselves, because what you guys are doing is you're actually creating clusters of information, clusters of ideas that you're curating for your audiences so they can come and build a relationship with this digital entity, with your brand, which is its own thing, and then learn through that by having you guys continuously nurture that professionally. Like, you both are professional creators, you get paid to do this, you make money doing this, that is your only job. So that is the role of social media as I see it from the experience of building a lot of brands online. And I'm curious what you guys think about that.
Yeah, recently I've had a lot of thoughts on social media. I've been exploring them from a somatic sense, like I could feel my body. There was a canary in the coal mine coming up probably 3 or 4 years ago. I think during the last 3 years, that has been amplified because I've sensed that speech has gotten less free in my experience. Like, you have the verified fact that social media platforms were actually curating information that was true in order to, quote unquote, protect people from experiencing hesitancy. I won't use all the trigger words that cause all the censorship. But what I think is interesting about it is that if you look at it from a nervous system perspective, social media is always evaluating you. So, one, you're being evaluated by the people who consume your content. And from a relational perspective, you were never meant to be in relationship with thousands, millions, billions of people. And so your nervous system has a really hard time. As much as consciousness, I think the shadow side of consciousness is the arrogance and the belief that we're not biological beings. Like, we're still in a meat suit. We still have a nervous system. And so I think the framework of the recognition of the constant evaluation is actually on another level on platforms that don't actually come, because unless you're actually converting somebody from Instagram to a product, you're not making money. Generally, there's no other, they're not compensating you for the endless amount of content you're creating. And I'd say the relationship that's really fascinating is that, one, you'll never know how it truly works. It's always a mystery. You're never told what success means. Like, how many times are you supposed to post? When are you supposed to post? Now you're supposed to dance. You're supposed to use this music. And if you post too long videos, that affects the algorithm. And if you actually try to convert somebody to something, that actually drives down the algorithm. So the very thing that might support you to be able to have the capacity. But I think the evaluation part is that an algorithm is always evaluating you. Now, relationally, of course, you and I in a conversation, we're open to influencing each other. If I say something or do something you don't agree with, you can share that with me, and we're in a symbiotic relationship. It's not symbiotic on social media. It's not relational. I can't even get a hold of customer service. So, it's like there's no way for me to say I'm feeling like there's a lack of recognition of my value on the other side. Here's what I would need, because their motivation is to monetize attention. And so there's not like a human. I mean, there is humans there, but they're social scientists whose whole job is to figure out how to actually keep you on a platform. And so I think when we look at Jonathan Haidt's new book on the anxious generation, I think it really speaks to, we have, especially young people, but and that's not an offense. I sound like an old guy when I say that, but like, young people they grew up with social media. At least, like, I grew up in the 90s, so I know life before smartphones and social media. And so we are the last generations to actually be able to sound an alarm, to say, hey, it hasn't always been like this. There's actually, and I think there's going to be an evolution of two paths. One group of people is going to move more back to analog life, maybe incorporating it a little more. And the other one's going to step into the singularity and get chips implanted in their brains. And I'm not saying one's more right than the other, but I think there is a desperate plea and cry for community and connection that is actually in person. As you were saying, Adam, that it it can never replace. Both of you were saying that it can never replace true human connection.
Digital is an augmentation. It is an extension of our human consciousness. This is the place where we go to play, right? But that is not the place where we got to live, right? Play can also mean learning. Play can be challenging. Play can be difficult. But that is where we are going to continue to develop as a species, is in the digital space. I love the evolutions of AI. I love the evolutions of virtual reality. All of these capacities are going to for sure drive our ability to be more human. But with that comes a lot of responsibility, because what is human is what the data scientists are trying to quantify. Now, I know some data scientists, and I know you do know as well, and this is actually where we're having a big challenge, is that they often don't know what being human is really like themselves. So it's like a blind leading the blind, right? There's a big gap right now, because exactly as you said, you can't reach customer service. And let's say even if you did, and even if you could get Mark Zuckerberg on the line and say, hey, Mark, man, what's up? I cannot have this human experience on your platform. He would not be able to translate that into actually quantifiable outcomes. The biggest challenge we're going to have is teaching these systems what humanity is. That is not going to happen until we figure it out themselves, at least to some average standpoint. Like, I mean, I have trouble explaining to my 6-year-old what being a human is like. Good luck explaining this to a computer system. So part of the challenge that we're actually going to have to learn is learning the key skills you're trying to coin here, Mark. That is the ability to disagree and find to some form of a consensual, relational answer that is going to further whatever connection we're trying to forge. First is between humans, and then eventually between humans and machines. So we kind of avoid that, Terminator, Matrix, horrible apocalyptic scenario, which is possible. A lot of people are very concerned about that, because they see the value and the power of these machines and what they can do. And we work with them on a daily basis, work with AI on a daily basis as it is. And Adam, even our work together, that's a core part that we are constantly monitoring for concerns and damages. So there's actually something I wanted to ask you, Mark. I have a standpoint, then my company, my own relationships, and even with all my clients. Every conflict has to have a consequence. Every conflict has to have a consequence. Otherwise, it instantly spirals into a control problem. What are your thoughts on that statement? Is that correct, or would you like to challenge me on it?
What do you mean by consequence?
Well, here's the best part. Every conflict has to have a consequence from the perspective of there has to be some form of change, or there has to be some form of, not really the right term, but a price to be paid for it. You cannot start a war and have nothing happen. You cannot start a confrontation and not assume that there will have to be some change.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that every frustration, under every frustration, is an unmet emotional need. So the outcome of a conflict, which I would argue that a conflict is really just two people trying to generate a deeper understanding or witnessing, as you guys were saying, of one another. But really, I'm trying to get a core need met. I'm trying to get a need met. And the strategy that's showing up as conflict, maybe my defensiveness or you're shutting down and withdrawing, these are strategies that we have to protect ourselves from being hurt in the conflict. And so I think of models like Imago Dialogue, which is, from Harville Hendricks and Helen Hunt, or the Gottmans have one too, which really are based off of how countries handle conflict too, ideally countries handle conflict, is that we actually are seeking to generate a positive outcome from it. So I think I like the word consequence, because it kind of like elicits what do you mean consequence? In that the consequence is positive that we're talking about.
Should be, ideally.
Yeah, and I think so. It's like every conflict has to have some invitation to a behavior change. And conflicts get repeated over and over time because we're still in the same patterns of communication. There's a great saying from Byron Katie where she says that you can't have war with one person. So as soon as one person changes how they orient to dialogue, you now all of a sudden have a totally different dance. And, if our former way of handling conflict was the cha-cha, and now we're being invited to do, I don't know, the two-step. I haven't done a dance in a long time. But the other person is going to be like, I thought we were cha-chaing. And so I think what happens with relationships is that we failed to have really clear agreements on what conflict means for us. We fail to have clear agreements on everything, but if we're going to have conflict, what is the outcome that we're always going to turn towards when we have conflict? So I really like what you're saying, that we're always going to have a consequence to this. Like there's going to be an agreement on behavior change and what that means for both of us, and that we're both accountable to the dance. So yeah, I totally agree.
What about a bad actor? A party who refuses to play with you, who refuses to be refuses to be cooperative and is malicious. They will enter a conflict and always try to make you pay the price for it, refuse to cooperate in any way.
Well, I have a baseline standard. Like we're either generating something or we're not. So there's a baseline agreement that we're going to treat each other with a mutual sense of positive regard, that there's respect as the baseline. That's the price of admission to the conversation. Like if you don't even respect my perspective, there's nowhere we're going to go, because you're going to want to convince me of your perspective. So that's not relational. To be relational is to say, I might not agree with you, but I actually, because there's always wisdom in someone's deeper truth. I think politically, this is what's so fascinating, is like, we're so quick to be like, how could you believe that? You must be an idiot. Instead of like, what is that actually appealing to you? What is it within that perspective or wing or whatever it is? And so we stop seeing each other as being, opportunities for learning and growth and change. We stop seeing the humanness in another person. I'm curious, Adam, what are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. So during my clinical experience, one of my mentors told me, Adam, you're going to work with a lot of people who have addictions over the course of your work. And I said, yeah. And they said, don't ever, ever, ever be one more person who yells at them for having an addiction, because you will just fail them. He said, if you actually want to help anybody who is wrong, harming themselves, doing an addiction, doing anything, not even just an addiction, but bad behaviors, be curious about them and ask them, be the one person who says, okay, you are addicted to heroin. Everybody else is yelling at them. What are the good things about that? What is leading you to do that? What are you pulling out of that? What need is it satisfying? Okay, these 3 things. Well, that makes sense. How do you feel about these other consequences that come because of it? Oh, you don't like them. Okay. So if you had a method of meeting these 3 needs but didn't have these consequences, would you pursue that? Okay. Well, why don't we find that together? Let's build that together. Here are some changes you could make. And when I started implementing that in my earlier work, I found a tremendous level of success with overcoming addictions that other therapists couldn't quite match, because they'd come in, negative, you're bad, this is why this is bad, don't you realize how bad that is for you, right? So as I leaned forward and using that now with attachment work, hey, look, you are high performing and you are not building sustainable relationships, and you're trying to convince your partner of this, and you're trying to push on them for this, you're avoiding hard conversations. What is good about that for you? How is that working? It's reducing your stress in these pieces, but it's doing this, and it's making stress harder in other areas. Okay, well, what if you could do that in a way that was low stress across the board, but one conversation that you could build together? Would you do that? You would. Fantastic. I can just teach that to you. Let's do it right now.
And I love that, because never underestimate the system's ability to perform its function within the limitations of its own resources. Like, that is something that most people forget. You say, hey, you are addicted to heroin, right? But in your world, that is the best you can be. You are the best at doing this with those constraints. And what you say is, I recognize the fact that you're able to operate in this way. Can I introduce and offer to you the opportunity to accomplish the same thing, but better? And you're playing into its strength. I'm a big proponent of playing into people's strength, of system strength, as opposed to trying to come in with a sledgehammer and destroying the whole thing. It doesn't work like that. People don't like to be wrecked. People like to be improved together. Like, that is a key thing in relationships, that it is something that is improved together. And just as actually a final thought, I want to pitch this to you guys. Relationships are an entity of its own, right? You have 2 people in a relationship, maybe multiple people in a relationship, but the relationship itself is a living, breathing entity, non-physical entity. And you refer to this a lot, Adam, as, your marriage is a business, right? Your marriage is an entity. Your relationship is an entity that lives and breathes on its own, needs to be protected. And one thing that you said, Mark, also it's interesting to me is, hey, your relationship needs not to suffer from you either withholding a truth or offering a truth. So how do you guys both, and I love, Mark, to hear you, and then Adam, you, how do you guys both explain and define this mysterious entity that is the relationship, the love, the connection? What is it, and what do we do with it?
I think so many of the stories we've been taught through Disney, through, I think of the famous line from Jerry Maguire, "You complete me," is this idea that a relationship consumes us, that we are part, like that it is us and our partner are puzzle pieces that just, they're our soulmate, our twin flame. And I learned a long time ago that if, I wish I had learned it longer, but I learned that when you feel completed by someone, it means that on some sense there was an incompleteness that leads to the, oh, you finally get me, you finally, etc. And that's where someone becomes an object of our love. They become an object of our happiness, our well-being. And so if we lose that, we then are incomplete again. And so for my wife and I think about the space between her and I as two separate human beings, where we both have passions, values, dreams, all that kind of stuff, that the relationship is a place that says, hey, bring that into the space between us. And then how do we actually curate this space, which I consider very sacred? Like if we could turn towards that from being a sacred place, then it's like, how do we actually cultivate this space to be a place where both of us come more alive, both of us step more into our potential? If there's friction, one of the rules that my wife and I have is that if something's coming up for one of us, it's coming up for both of us. The other one doesn't see it yet or feel it yet. So it's like a safe place for my wife or me to say, this is coming up for me. I'm not sure it makes sense, but I'm just feeling it. Do you have any sense about this? What I feel like I need from this is whatever it might be. So for me, it's really about, I know we come back to this because I think this is a core tenet of actually just healthy human relating, which is that we honor the truth above everything. That's it. It's like, I miss you. I feel like you're taking me for granted. I feel like my needs aren't being met. I mean, like whatever a truth is gets brought forward because how do we meet that within the relationship? And that for me has been so liberating in so many ways, because where I used to withdraw or hold back, now I'm like, oh, what's actually loving is to share the thing. And it's not going to be judged. It might not be received. It might not be agreed to, but I'm not sharing it to be agreed to. I'm sharing it so I can start to hear myself share, and that there's a space that is non-judgmental, that's seeking to learn from what's coming up for me, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I'm a big advocate for the relationship being that third party between you. I've talked extensively in the past about, a marriage is a business that you are both caring for, you're both nurturing, you're accomplishing something through. It's the business of family. Maybe we can present a new option here today. Is every relationship itself is a bit like a tree that exists between the two of you, right? My marriage is like a fruit tree, right? My friendship with you is like a fruit tree. The relationship, Mark, and you and I are building right now is a small tree that we're going to grow. As you both care for this tree, it grows. Eventually the relationship can provide you shelter during storms. It can feed you when you're hungry. You can draw from the tree, but you both have to nurture it. If one of you is nurturing the tree and the other one is chipping away at it with an axe, or is leaving the tree to starve and die or scorch, if you're tackling the roots and ripping them out just because you're bored, right? If you are both caring for the tree, you will both draw from the tree for the rest of your lives. Sustainable relationships would nurture a tree. Unsustainable things are going to kill that tree eventually. That's how I like to view relationships between two people. So when I act with somebody, and not upon them, but with them, what I try to think is, will this create a sustainable relationship for the next 50 years, if that's what we both want? And if so, I'm going to do this thing. If it doesn't, is this relationship itself sustainable? And if not, we need to tackle that immediately, because that is a serious problem. One person can't invest for 50 years if the other person's hoping to harvest that tree in 2 years.
I like that perspective.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Guys, this was a fantastic conversation. I can't believe the time flew as fast as it did. And then I think we're definitely going to have to do this one again. Mark, tell us a little bit more about where our audience can learn from you and work with you, and what can they do? What do you offer in terms of products and events and all that stuff?
Yeah, well, first off, thanks to both of you for having me, and to those of you watching and or listening that I don't take for granted the exchange of time and trusting us with these conversations. It means a lot. So you can find, I have a podcast called the Mark Rose Podcast. That's where you can find most of my thoughts, ramblings, guests. I have a YouTube channel, which you just look up my name. I have an Instagram called Create the Love, but on June 1st, I'm actually going to be leaving there because I've felt a real call to exit a relationship that it doesn't feel aligned. I wrote a book with my wife called Liberated Love that comes out right away on April 16th. And I was working with my friend who's a brand strategist, and I was realizing that so much of the friction that I was feeling with social media was because the relationship I have with my wife is generative. It's relational, and I couldn't in good conscience continue to consent to be in a relationship with a platform that I feel is not that. And I feel that saying of like how you do one thing is how you do everything was really starting to resonate, in that I'm like, I need to be in total alignment for me, which is not a projection onto other people that they can't have a healthy relationship with that. I just know I also don't drink because I knew I couldn't have a healthy relationship with alcohol, but lots of people can.
Awesome. And you have courses, you have a book coming up. How do people work with you?
Yeah, so you can go to createthelove.com or markgroves.com. Both will lead to courses. I have one called Dating 101, which is integrating the nervous system and attachment and all that in the dating process, which is really about turning dating into a healing and fun thing again. And I have one called, it's on breakup recovery, and that's for anyone going through a divorce or a breakup, which really allows a breakup to be a catalyst to transformation. And I have another one called Rediscover Your Wholeness. That's all about really stepping into one's full self, getting full alignment with our integrity and our values, and living a life from there, and then seeing what's possible. So yeah, you can find all of that just at createthelove.com. Is probably the easiest place.
Love it. All that's linked below, guys. Adam?
I am Adam Lane Smith, the attachment specialist. You can find my coaching, my community, my courses, everything on adamlanesmith.com. I'm on Instagram as @attachmentadam. I'm on YouTube as @attachmentadam. And I am here to help you build great relationships, nurture those trees, and hopefully plant them for the next 50 years.
Amazing. Thank you. I'm at Andrey Korikov on Instagram. And I wanted to also thank both of you gentlemen for coming out and spending the time today. Thank you for that. Beautiful wisdom, great conversation. I want to also thank Rugged Legacy Grooming Supply and the Veritas Creative Academy, so that they have made this podcast possible. And thank you both for the time. Everybody who's listening, thank you for the time. This is fantastic. Let's build more proper relationships. And we invite you to support us by following, subscribing, commenting, liking, sharing, all of the above. And we'll see you on the next one. Thank you very much.